most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are now at session 18, lesson 14 in the book. As we mentioned in the past couple of lessons, now that the author has proved the existence of God and explained how we must try to understand God not necessarily directly but through the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both of essence and existence, he is taking a few lessons to go through the major objections against the existence of God, against belief in religion. And so now that he has done a little bit of that, and he will continue for one more lesson with this, now he's attacking the materialist worldview directly. So this lesson is supposed to be about presenting some of the main principles, the main tenets of materialism. Materialism as a philosophy. You know, when we say something is materialistic, it could mean two things, or some materialism could mean two things. Materialism could mean, you know, your desire for worldly possessions, someone who's a materialist, and this is not what we're talking about. Or it could mean that it's a philosophical worldview, it's a philosophical position where you believe that the only things that exist are the ones that you see in space and time and basically matter. Bodily, corporeal, things that you can feel, taste, touch, and smell through your five senses. So this is what we're talking about. So as we said in this lesson, the author wants to address directly materialism. A lot of what is covered here are items, are points and topics that we've touched on before, but here he's going to address them directly. So the outline of the lesson is that at the beginning he basically lists the four major principles of materialism, and he explains very quickly what they are. In the book it's about one paragraph each, short paragraph. And then he goes on to what he calls assessing or critiquing each one of these. So we're not going to spend too much time on the presentation, first of all because it's not very complex, it doesn't require too much explaining, especially at the level we're taking this book. Otherwise, the reality is each one of these principles, there's entire books written about it, both from within Islam and by thinkers in philosophy and theology in general. Though both people who are claiming that these principles are valid and those who are trying to refute those people. So there's a lot of literature about this, and we'll talk about a few of the books throughout the lesson, inshallah, just so that if you're interested and you want to read more, you know where to start at least. Okay, so we're not following the exact same order of presentation. So basically the author just presents all four principles of materialism together, and then he refutes all of them together. So what we're going to do is present the first, refute it, present the second, refute it. I think it makes it easier to understand. But generally speaking, the items, the principles that he wants to talk about, the first one, in summary, basically means the claim that, the principle, don't forget, so all these are principles stating that materialism is true. And if materialism is true, it leads to non-belief in God and rejection of religion and all the rest. So all of these principles are together, taken together, they form materialism. This is the theoretical infrastructure, cognitive system for materialism. Alaykum salam. So the first one in summary is basically the principle that says all existence is equal to matter. Existence, anything that exists equals matter. So if it's not matter, it does not exist. Generally speaking, that's probably the most important one, and all of materialism boils down to this. So the rest is going to become details of this. But the reality is, this is materialism. Everything that exists is material. Everything that exists, only matter exists. No matter if you want to look at existence or matter, they mean the same thing. The second principle, matter is uncreated and eternal. So this can be a simple philosophical position, or it can be based on what a lot of present day science is saying. Laws of thermodynamics, saying that matter cannot be created or destroyed, everything is transformed in the world, and so on and so forth. So matter is uncreated. It does not require a cause. It's eternal. Therefore, we don't need to explain anything beyond what we see in the world from anything outside of it. The third principle, there is no purpose to existence. Existence here is we're not an existentialist philosophy. It's not about, my existence, my being in the world. It's when we look at the universe, we do not need to say there is a purpose, there's a finality, there's a design to anything that we see. That's what we mean. So when we look at things, and we'll see why they say that. The fourth one, all phenomena are the result of material interactions. So anything that we see, anything that we hear, anything that we observe in the world that we can think of, materialism tries to explain it through material interactions. Particles, atoms, biochemistry, physics, particles interacting with each other, explaining everything. There's one last principle that he mentions, and this is more of a epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. So all of this was theory of being. This is ontology. Everything we talked about, what exists and what doesn't exist. The last point, knowledge is only sensory knowledge. This is more the theory of knowledge, the philosophy of knowledge. So what can we know? What can't we know? And so on and so forth. So, of course, all of this has to be resting on a foundation of what are the acceptable, valid sources of knowledge to a human being. And I think I didn't talk more about the fifth one. Basically, in the lesson, he doesn't refute this one more than saying we actually already answered this last objection. And as you guys remember, we did refute this one. And we spent a lot of time explaining different types of knowledge and what's the area, the field of each one of the types of knowledge, where they are useful, where they're not useful. We talked about direct and indirect types of knowledge, philosophical knowledge, and abstract, mathematical, empirical knowledge. We talked about all of that, and we said that knowledge is not limited to only sensory perception of the world. And then, as we're saying, this is the outline of the course, so once he quickly gives a presentation, an overview of these four, he goes into what he calls the assessment or the evaluation of each one of these principles. So the first principle, presentation. So what is that principle? As we said, in short, the principle is everything that exists has to be or is only matter. Only matter exists. So everything that exists is necessarily material. So if there's anything that you posit that is not material, it necessarily does not exist. It does not even make any sense to talk about anything that is non-material. An immaterial being, by definition, cannot exist in a materialist worldview. So what is matter? So that's the second point. I don't know how clear this is. The second point is matter is basically anything that has extension. Al-madda is al-mamdud or med. So something that is extended. Extended basically in space. Something that occupies a space, a volume. And something that has the three dimensions. If you go back to basically classic Islamic philosophy, they clearly say it has three dimensions. Anything that occupies space, that's extension, has volume, that can have quantity, and that is divisible, that you can break down into parts. That's matter. These are the main properties of matter. And there's entire huge discussions about this that we're not going to get into. So since God, subhanahu wa ta'ala, since God, that we're those who are believers in God, claim that there is this being that exists that has none of these properties, by definition, out of necessity, God cannot exist. He's not extended in space, he doesn't occupy a volume, he cannot be observable, he cannot be broken down, doesn't have parts, so he cannot exist. God is non-material, immaterial, therefore he does not exist. And we talked a little bit about this already, but this is attacking directly materialism, the materialist thought. So how do we assess this, or how do we refute this first principle. First point is, as we said, this is the most important principle in the materialist worldview. So if you don't master this one, don't even go into debating or thinking about or reading too much materialist thought, because you need to be solid in understanding this principle. And basically the entire edifice of materialism is either this claim or secondary claims that come out of this claim. And the three others are basically claims coming out of this claim, the three others that we're going to talk about. So it's all about this one, that existence equals matter. That's the first point. So the refutation, and this is something we've talked about already a little bit. This should be, to anyone who is really objective, and we'll talk about that at the end of the course, anyone who's really objective should agree with this point, that empirical science, empirical means sciences that rely on your five senses, which is all of natural science. Natural science, relying on your five senses, its domain, what's allowed to talk about, cannot be anything beyond things that you can access with your five senses. If we agree with that, then the most we can say is there might be things, there may be things that the five senses cannot reach. And of course you can add intellect to that, and we'll talk about that at the end. So anyone who is objective and honest, sincere, truthful when they're talking about materialism, and they want to be empirical, they would have to first agree with us that there may or may not be things beyond what the senses reach. As we talked about, that our faculties are limited. So if there's something outside the reach of those faculties, anyone who is relying only on empirical data, on empirical science, is not allowed to make any claims about anything beyond the reach of the five senses. You're not allowed to talk about it if your only source are the five senses. If your only source are the tools of natural science, this is your only source of knowledge, this does not give you the right to talk about anything supernatural, anything beyond natural science. You can access, you can observe through your five senses anything that is within the scope, within the reach of the natural world. Or so it is claimed, although science is discovering things every day. But let's assume at least that part is within our grasp as human beings. We have access to the natural world because of those five senses. Beyond that, you're not allowed to say anything more. So for you to come and say, God is immaterial, therefore does not exist, does not work. If there is a God, and that God is immaterial, the most you can say is, I cannot reach him through my five senses. And you have to stop there. You're not allowed to make the additional claim, therefore he exists, or therefore he doesn't exist. You can't do that based only on empirical data and the faculties. So that's the first thing. So materialism cannot speak of anything immaterial. It's not allowed. Epistemologically or methodologically, it would be wrong. We know of the existence of immaterial entities. So we talked a little bit about that at the last lesson. We said, it's only someone who wants to be stubborn and polemical who would disagree or even doubt or object to the fact that there are immaterial entities in the world. And we gave a few examples, and we have some here. And we'll talk a little bit more about the soul. Awareness, feelings, and we gave a few examples of them. And we talked about the limitations of the senses too. So we said, first of all, when we're accessing the natural world, first of all, we're only accessing what each one of the faculties can access. Even within what should be potentially accessible within each faculty, we're not accessing the full spectrum. In other words, if concrete examples, from everything that could potentially be seen, my eyes only see a part. They don't see everything that could be seen. And if I look at other animals, they see a lot more. And we talked about, let's say, UV rays and infrared rays as examples, and there's so much more. That's as one example. There's something that could potentially be seen behind this wall, I can't see it. Okay, so I start seeing that even within the spectrum of what should be available within one faculty, it's limited. And then I can't hear with my eye. I can't smell with my ear. Why? So that tells me each one of the faculties is only accessing one type of information out there, which says I'm only limited to these 5 faculties. I don't know what other faculties I could have that would give me even more access to the world. So these are limitations that if we agree with them, then no one should come and say, and therefore you have access to the entire natural world. You're not even allowed to make that claim. And then beyond, you're of course not allowed to say, therefore the soul doesn't exist, or awareness is entirely material, or consciousness, or feelings, or. It's a huge jump that you shouldn't be allowed to make. Okay, the existence of the soul through, and so he basically very quickly here, a quick paragraph, and we're going to have to talk more about this in future lessons. But he says, specifically, he comes back in a small paragraph about the soul, and he says one of the best, easiest ways to prove the existence of the soul is through, for instance, dreams. So you see something in your dream, and then 2 days later, the same thing that you saw in your dream happens in the real world. So it's easy to dismiss when it's not happening to you, when it's happening to someone else. But when you're going through it and you know exactly what you saw, and then it happens to you in the exact same way, it's difficult for someone from the outside of that direct experience that you just had to come and say this did not happen, or it was an illusion, you're hallucinating, you're not sure what happened. Okay, so how do we explain that? So the easy explanation is there's a soul, and the soul is not limited by the same limitations as our bodies. It can travel in time and in space. And that's what happens when we sleep. That's the easy explanation that religion gives. So until we have something that can match it in science, which today we don't, because if we want to rely entirely on natural science, it says the soul doesn't even exist. Or if it does, we don't have any access to it. So this is the quick, and there's a lot more that we could add, but this is the quick one that he mentions in this lesson. So he talks about the dreams, or genuine dreams, spiritual exercise. So basically this is people like yogis, people who meditate, and then we see that they have bodily or spiritual capabilities that we don't find in other people. And the only way to explain that is to go towards something that is perhaps non-material. We're talking about their will, we're talking about their something spiritual, immaterial, that we can see a trace of it in their bodies. For instance, the different exercises that they do. And the last one is the miracles. So he just mentions it in passing without explaining it. And we'll talk about that. Inshallah, soon we're going to get to prophethood in the second volume of the book, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. There's different theories about miracles, and he doesn't explain anything in this lesson. But basically, so if someone reads it quickly, you don't notice, but he's basically saying we're proving the existence of the soul through, he gives three quick examples. Genuine dreams, the exercises, the spiritual exercises of people who do this kind of thing, and miracles. So let's come back to this one in a second. Let's finish the last point, and then we'll explain a little bit more. So we just went through 2 big refutations of materialism. The first one is materialism should not be allowed to say anything beyond its field, which is the natural world. It's not allowed to speak of things that it does not have access to. That's one. 2, there are things that are not material that human beings, generally speaking, all agree that they exist. 3, we've already proven the existence of God through logical, objective, solid proofs. So if we don't even go into whether anything else exists or not, that is immaterial or material, whatever we end up saying about the rest of the world, for God specifically, we've already proven the existence of God. So your proof that there is nothing immaterial is already disqualified, because for me, through the necessary being proof, through the design, and through other proofs that we didn't really get into in this course, if I was able to prove that entity is also immaterial, I've already proven that there's something immaterial that exists. So that, I'm hoping that that piece is clear. Okay, so now let's go to this quick mention that he makes about miracles. So this is not in the book, we're just adding a bit of clarification. So here are two verses of the Quran that we want to look at very quickly. The first verse of the Quran, chapter 38, verse 36. This is talking about the Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam. It says, "Then we subjected the wind to his power, flowing gently to his order wherever he desired." Okay, so one of the well-known capabilities, miraculous capabilities given to Sulaiman, peace upon him, was that the winds and the clouds would basically obey his orders. They would follow his desire, as the verse says. بِأَمْرِهِ. Okay, a second verse. This one is about Jesus, Isa alayhi salam. There's a beginning to the verse, and then he says, "I have certainly brought you a sign from your Lord. I will create for you out of clay the form of a bird. Then I will breathe into it, and it will become a bird by Allah's permission. And I heal the blind and the leper, and I revive the dead by Allah's permission. And I will tell you what you have eaten and what you have stored in your houses. There is indeed a sign in that for you, should you be faithful." Okay. These verses in the Quran, if we look at them from that point of view of miracles, and go back to the author saying miracles can prove that the soul exists, where's the link? So generally speaking, in Islamic theology, there's been a few theories about how miracles occur. One theory says a miracle is basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervening directly in the world. That's one theory. A second theory, so this is something happening from outside of our universe, outside from our world. Allah's power directly intervening, making these things happen. A second theory is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends angels. So it's not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. He delegates that responsibility, but these creatures are still outside from the material world, from our world, and they're the ones who act on it. That's a theory. Now there's a few theories, I'm just talking about the big ones. And another theory is that the miracles, these examples of miracles, because miracles fall in different categories, the miracles are actually being performed by those people themselves. But they're being performed by people who have that kind of soul. They have that kind of power, spiritual power, to be able to do that. So in these cases, these people who are divinely appointed, these people who are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from an ethical perspective, we would say they've purified themselves to the point of being a lot closer to Allah, spiritual nearness, so they can control the world a lot more than people who don't have that nearness. Their soul is a lot greater, a lot more powerful than our soul. In body, they're the same body. They have the same type of body. So what allows someone like Sulaiman alayhi salam to control the wind? Or the clouds? Or the rain, basically, that's what it's saying. It's his soul. But this means this is a different interpretation, because sometimes people read this and they say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is performing the action, but the one, intermediary, like a puppet in the middle, is Sulaiman alayhi salam, or is Isa alayhi salam. A careful reading of the verses is not saying that. The verses are saying that it is Sulaiman alayhi salam's will and desire and command and order that is in action here, not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's. The same thing for the second verse. The verse is not saying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creating the bird out of clay. Isa alayhi salam says, "I create out of clay." But he adds a caveat, and the Quran always does that. When it talks about something that may generate doubt, and then people fall in the biggest issue the Quran has, which is you're starting to doubt Tawheed. You're starting to doubt the ultimate absolute power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It comes and reminds you. So it says, Isa alayhi salam says, "I create." He's the one creating. Through that spiritual capability, through his soul, through the level of his soul. He's the one who's creating with Allah's permission. But the with Allah's permission is not special to Isa alayhi salam. That with Allah's permission is everything. Who has any power? What has any power that is not through Allah's permission? The fire burns through Allah's permission. The water quenches my thirst through Allah's permission. Everything is through Allah's permission. So here there's nothing specific, anything special or extraordinary about Allah's permission for Isa alayhi salam. It's a reminder so that people don't say, therefore he is a God. Therefore he is the son of God. Therefore he has some sort of autonomy. He sits outside of the real tawheed, which is what we talked about, and that's why I added it in the end. This is what we talked about when we said, so long as you understand causality as not always being horizontal, it's vertical. If you can do, it's because you've been enabled to do. It's not independent power. It's not independent authority that you have that allows you to create or that allows you to do anything. It's all coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's no contradiction with Tawheed. The exact how, this becomes a topic for huge discussions, and I'm gonna dare say we'll never really know unless any of us can actually perform this, and then we'll really know. So it's a matter for theoretical discussion, and inshallah we'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about prophethood and miracles falling under prophethood in the second volume of the book. So when the author, in passing, he just says, and miracles can prove the soul, that's what he's talking about. It's this theory that if miracles can be performed, it proves the existence of the soul, because those people performing the miracles are like you and me in matter. As a body, they're like you and me. So what explains the rest? It's something immaterial, and that something immaterial is called the soul, and so it proves the soul. That's the argument, but it's not explained in the book. The second point I wanted to make here, and we talked a little bit about it, but just to bring it back. So here the claim, as we said, the claim was that everything is matter. That includes our access to the world, everything being material. So those people who only want to accept material entities, they also only want to rely on material entities to assess them. So they become empiricists, right? They only agree with the existence, they validate existence of things that they can assess, they have access to through the five senses. Is it true that the five senses can actually say anything of significance about the world? No. Even when we have access to something in the world, that something is one individual instance of something. I then have to come and add a layer that we take for granted, because this is how our mind works, that does all the rational work with the data that I'm getting through my senses. For instance, it does induction, or probability, or generalization, or abstraction, and by looking through 1,000 examples and doing mathematical equations, I can come up with, relativity theory, or I can come up with gravitational acceleration, or I can come up with, how did I do that? Is it entirely only on the senses? No. I looked, the senses gave me access to instances that then I had to work with, non-materially, non-materialistically. The working, the rationalization, that layer is added, this is not material. The computation that I'm doing with what I'm seeing, the generalization that tells me true or false, could be right or wrong. I see 1,000 crows and they're all black, and it says, in my mind, crows are black. Okay, that's induction. I don't know how many crows are still out there that I haven't seen, but all the ones that I have seen are black. Am I allowed to make that generalization or not? This logical operation, where does it come from? Is it material? It's not material. Material is I just keep seeing single crows. I can't make any statement about all crows. This is a rational layer that is added on what the senses have access to. So even that claim, we have to take it with when they say it's empirical, natural science is accessible through the senses, okay, but do we still agree that there's a rational component that is not entirely empirical?
Sayid, how would they answer that if it's supposed to?
They say that computation and that abstraction, that's part of what the mind does. And so that brings the argument back to what is the mind. So that's the best of them. So this is at least to shut the door on those who say it's only empirical. Because there are those who say empirical includes all the rational dimension. So this, I think, is open for a good discussion, and may the best win. But I don't think it's as easy as saying it's all material. Every computational, logical activity that your mind does can be reduced to only matter. I don't know. So those who want to claim that, they could claim that, and you have to come back with, is all the activity of the mind material or not? And you can get into neuroscience with them and what's actually happening, and is it that enough to explain or not?
It's something as simple as imagination
and creativity and
how is that material?
Yeah.
That's
so we say it's not.
Yeah, but that'd be hard for them to answer that.
But they say it is because they're stuck. What's the alternative?
That existence can be immaterial.
And then that opens the door to things they don't want to deal with.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, that's exactly that's what you have to ask them. Okay, second principle. The second principle of materialism is that matter is eternal, uncreated. If matter is eternal and uncreated, it basically could be the equivalent of what we said about God being the necessary being. It does not require an external cause. It explains itself by itself. It almost exists as a fact, and that's it. Don't ask, because nothing can ever be created, nothing can ever be destroyed, everything is only transformed, matter, and now, the past little century, they've added energy into it, so it's one more kind of escape. So it's not only matter, it's matter. If I'm stuck, I can say it's energy, and energy, I'm stuck, I make it back into matter, and at least something is happening. So what's the refutation of this? The first point is claiming, so to make the link with what we just said, for someone to claim, I'm a materialist, I look at the world, I see matter, and I allow myself to claim that matter is eternal and therefore uncaused, I'm not allowed to make that claim. I'm not allowed to reach that conclusion because there's nothing in experimentation, nothing in natural science that allows me to declare anything as being eternal or uncreated. There's a limitation there. How do I test that? Can I put that in a lab and see if it's uncreated or created? So there's work currently being done about that. But that's the claim. That once you're talking about these items, these types of claims about eternity and creation, ex nihilo, of course, that's what we're talking about, then you're outside the sphere of natural science, and now you're into theology and philosophy and other fields. Natural science doesn't have the tools to tell you whether matter can really exist out of nothing or disappear into nothing. The system that we know is, today science is here, matter is here, and these are the laws that govern it. You cannot jump from there to say, therefore it is eternal. We can't say it's eternal. Maybe it was created this way. How can you bring that into under experimentation? Under what the empirical sciences allow you to say or to reach? That's the first point. Second point. If we were to accept that matter is very eternal, no problem with that, does that mean that it does not require a cause? Here there is a point that is not mentioned in the book, and I didn't want to get into it, but I have to add it so that this becomes clear. For this point to be clear, we have to open our minds to the possibility that causality is not necessarily temporal. For something to be the cause of something else, it does not necessarily have to happen before it in time. Okay? So that's let's call it an axiom. In philosophy, they call these axioms. So you have to accept it for now. It's not an axiom in itself. I'm asking you to accept it because we don't have time to explain that entire argument. But the idea is there's an implied statement here that is not being made that something can be the cause of something even though it does not come before it in time. It could happen at the same time. And it's still the cause. So the causality is what they call in order, not in time. So if I were to, let's say, turn the key to get into my home or my car, the key is turning at the same time as I'm turning my hand. It's not before, it's at the same time. But there's still a cause. The key does not turn on its own. There is an external cause making it to turn. It's not happening before in time, it's happening at the same time. So sometimes we don't look at time. We only look at the order. So the link that's the second point. The link is not necessarily in time. The link can be in order. Okay, so the first point, I cannot use science to say something is eternal or non-eternal. That's outside what science can say. Second point, if we are to accept that something is eternal, it still may require a cause. In what sense? Let's go back to a few lessons when we talked about the different kinds of existence. We said some of them are necessary and some of them are contingent. If something is contingent, if something is only possible, if something requires something else to make it what it is, there is nothing that necessitates that it exists or that it exists in this manner, then it needs something from the outside to make it this way. And any human being who has a sane mentality would agree with this. This is causality. For something to be, it needs an external cause, so long as it's contingent, so long as it's a non-necessary being. If it does not necessarily need to exist, or does not necessarily need to exist in this manner. So why is it this way? Why does it exist, and why does it exist in this way? So unless you can tell me why, with matter, with energy, it means it's a non-necessary existent. So putting aside its eternity, why is it, and why is it this way? And for those questions, I need something outside of matter to explain it to me. Matter itself cannot explain that. Last point. When we went through the proof of the necessary being, we gave attributes to that necessary being. We said it cannot be temporal, it cannot be spatial, it cannot be something that you can divide into parts because it's going to be conditioned on those parts to exist. Okay, all of that applies to matter. Because it applies to matter, matter cannot be the necessary being. So for this one, go back a few lessons ago, I think lessons 7, 8, around there, we talked about the proof of the necessary being. And when we look at those attributes, those properties, and we try to apply them to matter, we see it doesn't work. So matter cannot be the necessary being. Therefore, it's contingent. Therefore, everything else we just said. So that's the answer to this second claim, or second claim, that matter is eternal and uncreated, and therefore it could even be the necessary being. It cannot be, science cannot say that. Even if it is eternal, it still requires a cause, and it could never be the necessary being. Third principle of materialism. Yes?
So would the angels have been created in order?
It depends.
Not in time?
It depends. It depends which school of thought you follow.
So some has like this.
So generally speaking, al-mutakallimin, they were always in agreement with temporal creation. And philosophers believed in non-temporal creation.
So they kind of always existed with God.
But it doesn't mean that they're independent. Exactly. They're not. Doesn't mean that they have any independence.
It's a great analogy, the car and the key.
So,
very good analogy.
Okay, so this is why AlHasany, for instance, attacks people like Ibn Sina, and he says they're kuffar. Yeah. If you read his works, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa, that's what he's talking about. He's basically saying philosophers, because they do not, it's 3 or 4 points that he attacks, that's one of them. Because they do not believe in the temporal creation of the world, or anything in it, they are kuffar.
Sayid, by temporal you mean like...
in time, created in time.
Not eternal.
It could be eternal.
But temporal is not eternal.
Yes, exactly.
Like, say, can you elaborate a bit on time? In time, it means like you create something and then after hundreds of years, create something else. That's what in time means.
In our very, very,
Like,
okay, I'm going to say it in a very simplistic way.
Yeah.
It's as though they're saying there might be a time when only God exists and nothing, and then God decided to create the world, which is what the majority of people understand, let's say, when they read the Quran, right? For instance, all religions, all of that. Philosophers say that's not how it was. Yes, there was an act of creation, but it's not like there was nothing and then there was something. There was always something because of their understanding of divine attributes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by essence, He is Jawad. He is generous. He emanates existence or creation at all times. There cannot be a time when His generosity stops or diminishes. Okay, so that's where the philosophers are coming from. And it solves some issues for them. Because what was God doing before creating the world? As though creating the world is His work. Okay? But anyways, so that's where they're coming from. And the mutakallimin say you're going against scripture. We don't care what your arguments are. Goes against scripture, you're kafir. End of story. And they tell them you don't understand anything about God. You're simpletons. And that's the struggle between the mutakallimin and the philosophers.
Say, yeah. I've never, like, if you read like with Ibn Taymiyyah or Ghazali or whoever, they use a lot of philosophy.
They use logic.
But even philosophy, you can almost say.
Yes.
Because
of course,
the part of philosophy, like how are you going to have
to
a
refute
discussion?
a philosopher, you have to be a philosopher.
So
yes.
How do they explain the fact that they do kufr on philosophy, but they themselves and they have sometimes a lot of very strong arguments, philosophical.
Yeah.
So how do they reconcile that?
Well, they don't say it's philosophy.
What do
like
they say?
Yazdi says, I'm not using philosophy; it's just common sense.
But that's what
Yazdi is a
philosophy is.
philosopher. Yeah, but so obviously that's the first thing people say about AlHasany is he's attacking philosophy and saying, philosophy is all wrong and kufr, and the reality is he is a philosopher himself, although he's not agreeing with their conclusions. And that's why Ibn Rushd wrote his book. He wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, and Ibn Rushd came after Al-Ghazali and he wrote Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence. Okay, where he refutes again Al-Ghazali's attacks on Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina and Al-Kindi. Al-Ghazali attacks them, so Ibn Rushd comes and attacks him, and so on and so forth. And then he wrote another treatise, the epistle on the alignment basically between religion and reason. Very famous, and he tried to say that basically they go together. Whatever religion says, reason says, and whatever reason says, religion says. And even that is a problem. But anyways,
Ghazali is like, even now he's kind of like romanticized as a mystic and as a philosopher.
Because he was all of them. Because he had
But it's
phases
funny
in his
because he
life.
made attack that I would think, I wonder if he'd be happy with that or annoyed.
Probably annoyed. Anyways, we'll talk more about Ghazali. Third principle, materialism. There is no purpose, no finality, no design. So when we look at the world, we look at the universe, we say there is no design in the world, there is no purpose to the world, there cannot be any finality, any point to anything. It's all random, it's all chaos, just coming and happening, and that's it. Why? Why would anyone who observes how the world works say that? Because the moment I say anything else, I have to explain it with an intelligent designer. So this one I find is an argument that is after the fact. I know that I will be stuck having to agree that there is something immaterial, something that contradicts my materialism. The moment I open the door and I say, I don't know if you guys remember when we presented the proof by design, we said, you're either saying, if you're trying to object to it, you're either saying there is no design, or you're saying there is design, but it has no designer. And I told you guys the second one is very weak. So if it were me and I wanted to attack design, I would say there's no design. So I have to say there is no design. The moment I say there's design, I have to explain where it comes from. If I look at anything, and the irreducible complexity idea that we talked about a little bit when we talked about that Michael Behe, he talks about how a mousetrap works. And how many components are there in a mousetrap? It's very simple. But if one of them does not work the way it's supposed to, that trap will not work. Would someone look at that and say this happened randomly? Can we think of any scenario, any situation that would end up creating something like a mousetrap randomly, chaotically, without any purpose, without any intelligence, without any design? So the moment I agree that there is design, and that's why they fight so much against this proof. It's not that I actually believe that there is no design, and we're going to read a couple of quotes. It's that the moment I agree there is, that I have to explain where it comes from. And some of them are very objective, and they say it's a mystery, and I stop here. I have no answer. And personally, okay, that's at least respectable. I can live with that. But someone to still see that, and I'm going to say, I'm seeing design. Obviously, there's intelligence behind this. There has to be. There has to be wisdom. There has to be. But if I say that, then that kind of makes my entire cognitive infrastructure crumble. So I'm just going to say, I know it's there, but I can't agree with it. I have to pretend, I have to claim that it doesn't exist. Yeah.
It's very, very quickly, like this, what you said now, it applies on agnostic people, for example. But like, I'm just curious, is there any atheists that believe in design, but they say, but nothing God?
Well, they talk about mystery. But that would require a lot more. We're going to read a couple, and I intentionally said those. There are atheists who say there is. Design. Martin Rees is a huge one, and I talked about him. He has this book called Just 6 Numbers, for instance, where he basically saying those 6 equations, constants in the universe, explain everything in the universe. Okay, but that just proved everything. The fact that there are natural laws, universal laws, where does the law come from? Why is it a law? This is the point that we really have to drill down into. And so those who have really looked at all of that, they say there's about 22 of them. But he explained it with only 6. And it's a very famous book, and he's written other books, and I have a little quote from him at the end. This guy openly says, I'm atheist. And in fact, he says, I go to the church all the time too. So anyways. Proving the existence of a creator. So refutation is, while someone says there is no design, if I show that there is design, that stops. 1. 2, if I show that the design requires a designer, so the proof that we gave is the first refutation to this. Okay, so that's the first point. Second thing, does the atheist believe, and this is what the author says, do they actually believe that there is no... So now he's talking to them more as a, he's preaching to their soul, as opposed to giving a philosophical argument. He's basically saying, are you really denying design? Like, are you really denying that there's no intelligence in anything you're seeing? What else can I tell you? Like, so basically the paragraph goes into more of a morale. He's doing morale as opposed to a philosophical argument. Does the atheist believe that they have truly a satisfying answer if they say there is no design? So what's their answer? How do they explain any of this? Yeah.
Like a few slides back when you had that materiality is volume and space and etc.
Yeah.
And so an atheist would look at that and say there's no God.
Yeah.
And then a believer looks at that, it says there's a God.
Yes.
The exact same evidence for both arguments is used.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's not like that. What's the verse of the Quran say? Like, Allah shows us our sign, it increases in the believer their iman, and it increases the kufr in the...
Yes, or the Holy Quran
it's
itself.
incredible,
Yes, the Holy Quran itself. That لا يزيد الظالمين إلا خسارة, for instance. So the Quran is a remedy for those who are believers. And as for those who are not believers, exactly. It all depends. And
there isn't even a difference in the argument. It's the exact same argument. One uses it to support, the other uses it to disprove. And it's just one's increasing in iman, the other one is increasing in kufr.
Yeah. That's a big point. It's gonna take too much time, and I know I'm already past my time, so I'm gonna keep going. That there is no design despite the so basically that's the second point that he makes. So first of all, there is, and if there isn't, then how do you explain anything? So just saying it's a mystery, does that solve it? Fourth principle, all phenomena, basically all causality, he says phenomena, but basically anything that is a cause of anything else is nothing but material. That's the last principle of materialism. The refutation, nothing new could ever emerge. So that's their first refutation. So if I look at the world and I see things like life, awareness, feelings, these things that are non-material, creativity, will, where did they come from? So he's saying the counter argument to this is, yeah, it's all matter. It's all already in matter. So what's the answer? So none of these things have any of the properties of matter. That's the first. So we explained what matter was. We said it has extension, it has volume, it's divisible, it has parts, for instance. It doesn't apply. How do you talk about will? How do you talk about intelligence? How do you talk about awareness in those terms? What does it mean? Those entities are related to life. So the second point is there was a time when they did not exist. So they did emerge. So why weren't they there right from the beginning? What explains this change? Or is it all random interactions? Do the random interactions explain? So the first argument, the first point is they can't explain because the properties of matter are not in them. The second argument is they were not there. There was a time when those things were not there in the universe. There was no life that we know of, and so on and so forth. So again, it goes back to what we call the efficient cause. When we talked about the 4 types of causes, according to the Aristotelian terminology, you can say that we have the material cause. We have what the work is being done on. You see a table and you say, oh, there's a table, but where did the table come from? You can tell me it's made of wood, but why does it exist? These are 2 different whys. These are 2 different causes. One of them is the wood from which it was created. One of them maybe is the guy who sat and created it, designed it, thought about it, and created it. But he needs an intention. That's the final cause. That's the efficient. That's the thing that makes it come, the reason why it is there. And not what it's made of, which is what we're explaining with matter. Materialism, that's the last point. Materialism equals determinism. So now he goes into a completely different type of argument, and he says, if we want to limit everything to matter, material interactions on their own lead to a deterministic world. Everything that happens will be predetermined by natural laws. Particles interact in one way. There's not a million ways they interact with each other. Okay, so what does that lead to? And we'll talk more about that in future lessons, but very quickly, 2 things he says. First of all, we all know, we all feel directly that we have free will. We feel our choice in actions when we choose. I choose to say the next word or I don't. I feel it. I have a direct access to it. I don't need an external argument for it. 1. So that goes directly against that experience. So especially for someone who's materialistic or believes in materialism, how do you explain that? 2, so what do we do about the social disorder that this creates? So if someone commits a crime, kills someone, how do you explain it? They can just say, it's matter. Matter interacting with matter, I'm not responsible. There's no reason to punish, there's no reason to... How do you live a civilized life as a society if everything is only determined by natural laws that are limited, reducible to interactions between particles? You have no human free will in there. The interactions happen on their own, whether you exist or not. Even your will is explained through that interaction. Final thoughts. I'm not going to go into this because I think we already took too long. But very quickly, keep in mind, this is a quick note, keep in mind, there are footnotes, especially for people following in the book. Everything we're presenting is based on the classic Islamic philosophy theory. So this is, it is what it is. We're not saying it's right, it's wrong, but it's a certain way of seeing the world. Islamic philosophy comes to us from medieval times. At that time, that philosophy itself was taken by the West. Europe took that philosophy itself as is, and then centuries later, it started going in a completely different direction for different factors. So today, this kind of thinking does not exist as is in Western philosophy. So ideas like what's matter, and there's a substance and an accident, for instance, and I was thinking maybe of talking a little bit about that, but I don't think we have a lot of time. The way you look at existence, you can split it into different categories or according to different criteria. One criteria is you look at a thing and you say, is it a substance or is it an accident? An accident is basically an attribute, something you describe something else with. If I say something is 3, there's 3 of it. The 3 is not, it can't be on its own. The 3 is a qualifier to something else. It's a property of something that can be 3. So what is it? That's a substance. It could be 3 apples. Or I could say red apple. Okay, the redness doesn't exist on its own. It needs an apple to exist. That's a substance, and that's an accident. That's one way to look at things that exist. And another one is matter. All of these actually connect. So those who do advanced studies in Islamic philosophy, this is where you start looking at, is matter a substance or is it an accident? If it's a substance, what does it mean? Is God a substance? Does he have accidents? And so that opens the door to a completely different kind of discussion. The majority of what we're saying right now, why I'm saying this, is if you read between the lines, the reality is I'm presenting it in a way that I think is compatible with what we have as a backdrop and as a, let's say, cognitive infrastructure. But the reality is that the nuances here all come from the philosophy of Mullah Sadra. And this is the part that goes unsaid as the book progresses, but it's resting the philosophical foundations. If we were to do advanced studies, this is where we would get them. This is all based on the philosophy of Mullah Sadra. So this is not saying it's right or it's wrong, but we have to know that when we drill into the arguments. So that if we need to change, we use a different argument. One of the arguments we presented has a weakness or they don't agree with the premise in it. This is probably the reason. Because at the end of the day, we're relying on a foundation that's coming from what we call al-hikmah al-muta'aliya, the school of Mullah Sadra, and they may be using a completely different way of. Today, when they talk about accidents, which we said is attributes or descriptors or qualifiers, in modern philosophy they call them properties. So they combine the notions of property and contingency together, and that gives you what we used to call accidents. Until today, works of Islamic philosophy use that old terminology, but in Western philosophy they no longer use that terminology. Anyways, the second point I had here was the definition of matter. I'm not saying we need to look at it and review it today, but the fact that we have limited the definition of matter as something that has extension and volume may start causing us problems. And even in the West, that's what everybody agrees on. This is what matter is. But the moment you get into things like quantum physics, you're going to start having some issues. Because quantum physics thinks that there are particles that don't have a mass. So if there's a particle that has no mass, or there is a particle like a photon, which is a light particle, that behaves like something that has a mass, but it has no mass, so it's a body, but it also behaves like a wave, or an atom that has electrons, and now they're saying the electrons are not actual particles, or they are, but they are like more a wave, and they're attached in somewhere else in the universe, and so on and so forth. That kind of opens the door to maybe having to review the definition of what matter is. I'm not saying we have to do it tomorrow. Even in physics, they're having issues with this, because it's like there's two worlds. There's everything bigger and everything smaller. There's the world of quantum physics. It's a whole universe with its own laws and its own way of interacting with each other. And then there's everything that is under the relativity theory and Newtonian mechanics and so on and so forth. Okay, these are two completely different worlds, and they haven't been able to put them together. But if that other world, if that whole theory makes sense and it's working and it's starting to work, then I think we have to open the door to rethinking what matter is so that we're not stuck. You're still a materialist if you think that's all that exists. But maybe we have to define matter in a different way, as opposed to saying that something has an extension in time, or that has mass, or that has volume. Because we're now into maybe other types of entities. And it's not for those reasons, but when we go to those old philosophies like Mullah Sadra and Sahrawardi, Sheikh al-Ishraf, those are illuminationist school, they came up with a in-between category of existence. Things that are barzakh, are between matter and non-matter, between material and non-material beings. Okay, we may need to go there. And maybe this is, and of course they fall more on the immaterial, but they somehow link to the material world. And this is, I think, where we're going. So this is, if anyone wants to do kind of more advanced work on in ilm al-kalam and aqaid, we have to rethink and work on those things. Anyways, a few more final thoughts. I'm not going to talk a lot. I'm just reading a few quotes here, so it'll go very quickly. Stephen Jay Gould. Okay, this guy is very well known. Atheist. Agnostic atheist. Okay? He says the net, he calls it the magisterium. So basically the field, and a field of authority is a magisterium. So he invented an idea called the non-overlapping magisterium. Okay? So NOMA. Stephen Jay Gould, and that became a thing in the world of theism, atheism. Basically, he says there's two fields that are not overlapping, science and religion. Okay, so the net or magisterium of science covers the empirical realm. What is the universe made of? Facts. And why does it work this way? Theory. The magisterium of religion extends over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. These two magisteria do not overlap, nor do they encompass all inquiry. Now, I disagree with some aspects of what he's saying, but at least he's recognizing that there is value, there is validity, and there are limitations to what science can say and cannot say. This is the point for me here. Okay? So he's recognizing that there are things that science cannot talk about. Science can tell us what the universe is made of and why does it work this way. That's it. Okay. Second quote. Martin Rees, and we just talked about him. The preeminent mystery is why anything exists at all. What breathes life into the equations and actualizes them into a real cosmos? Such questions lie beyond science. However, they are the province of philosophers and theologians. Clear enough, I think, again. Counted as a clear atheist. He says, by the way, that he goes to church. Okay, but he doesn't go to church for religious reasons. He goes there because he says this is what civilized people do in a civilized society. I don't attack you, I do what you do so that we can live in peace, and these are rituals in society and so on and so forth. But again, there's a recognition that science has a limitation. And he's saying this is the why. I can tell you the equations. I can tell you what would happen if they're not there. But I can't tell you what breathed life into them in his works. Okay. Science is a way of knowing about the natural world. It is limited to explaining the natural world through natural causes. Science can say nothing about the supernatural. Whether God exists or not is a question about which science is neutral. This was written by the US National Academy of Science. I don't think you get more sciencey than that. Right? A quote from Einstein. In view of such harmony in the cosmos, which I, with my limited human mind, am able to recognize, there are yet people who say there is no God. But what really makes me angry is that they quote me for the support of such views. Okay? So all of this I was going to say in contrast to, there was a book recently written by Victor Stenger. The book is called God, the Failed Hypothesis. How science shows that God does not exist. It's a very big claim. When all of these people are saying, science cannot say, science is limited. That's the whole point of the lesson. Is that science has a field. It has tools that allow it to access a certain field, a certain sphere. I can't talk about anything outside of that sphere. For instance, God. And this guy claims that science is going to show that God does not exist. And no one dares do that. No one says, That's why in recent years they flipped the argument since the 1800s, and now it's very clear. Any atheist will tell you it's not up to me to show that God doesn't exist. It's up to you to show that God does. No one goes there because it's impossible to prove God doesn't exist. But this guy uses science to claim, of course.
Maybe it's just a catchy...
No, I read the book, and he makes a claim, and he confuses. He basically says that a hypothesis has to be scientific, Okay, so if my hypothesis is that God exists, that doesn't work. That hypothesis doesn't make any sense because it's not material. Anyways, so I'm saying that just so in case you guys hear about this guy's a very big name, and he has many public debates about people who believe in God, and he's kind of like a Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and others, but this guy's really about
what do you
science.
think of them, Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris?
After we finish the session,
I think I'm done. I'm done.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم